The federal government will invest more than $40 million to address what they have called critical backlog of repair work to Sydney Harbour. Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek says Labor is underdoing the damage left behind, quote, caused by the Liberals and Nationals. $45.2 million will be allocated in the budget, due to be handed down on Tuesday by Treasurer Jim Chalmers for the iconic harbour. It includes $26.5 million to replace rotting wharves and docks, $7.6 million to repair immediate safety concerns such as rock falls from cliffs, $5 million for critical maintenance work to keep sites open and safe, $3.5 million for heritage advice and project management, and $2.6 million for repair of critical infrastructure, including unstable seawalls and deteriorating wharves. For his analysis on the upcoming budget, 6 News spoke to Steve Baty from the Australian Democrats.
It's going to be a tricky budget for the government, Leo. I think there's no doubt about that. The economic conditions broadly are tricky. So in fairness to them, they've got a few things that they need to balance and a few things that they need to navigate as they go through this process of delivering what is an important marker in the economic year, and certainly an important marker for a government to deliver. We've got inflation running at 7%, and it is coming down, but it's historically very high, and it's obviously well outside the target band that the Reserve Bank looks for of that 2 to 3%. Wages growth are running at 3.3% at the moment, year on year, which means real wages are going backwards, and going backwards fast. The estimates for growth in the economy are only 1.5%, and that's due to persist for the next 2 years. So that's sluggish at best. And the last thing the government wants to do is tip the economy into a recession. That would not look good for them. On the flip side, we've got $895 billion in national debt. It's forecast to go up over $1 trillion over the next 4 years. And that's something else that they very much have to consider. All of that hits our lowest income households the most. So they're being hit hardest at the moment with that combination of factors. And absolutely, the change in the rate for Jobseeker recipients for all forms of support payments really need to be increased. And it's something that everyone is going to be looking for in this budget.
So in general, and you did touch on it there, but given there's both the international challenges, especially around issues like inflation, there's things that you could argue were just kind of left over from the coalition government. They haven't just emerged in the past 12 months. Do you think there's any way that the Treasurer of the government will be able to please people, or is this going to be one of those tough budgets with one of those the line about this is what needs to be done, there's no avoiding this, etc., etc.?
I think that they definitely have ways that they can deliver relief for households, especially those low-income households, and do it in a way that's not going to drive inflation, and do it in a way that's not going to drive up the debt further. We know at the moment that due to inflation, government revenue is actually up. So there's an expectation that we'll actually be much closer to a surplus in this budget than was even expected in the October budget, where it was forecast at about $36 billion. So as a result of inflation, as a result of higher commodity prices, we actually think that the budget may come in much closer to either a break-even point or maybe even a surplus. The government has lots of options, though, in terms of how it can deliver that kind of cost of living relief to those low-income households without driving up inflation. It can do things like add items to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. It can increase the Medicare rebate for GP visits. It can increase access to mental health services. It can, and it has already announced that it will introduce childcare and early childhood education benefits into households, I think up to 95% of the cost. These are all things that actually have a deflationary impact on the economy. They actually bring prices down rather than drive them up. All of those things can be targeted at those low-income households. It doesn't require them to increase any of those job seeker rates or any of those benefit rates, but at the same time, they can in fact target those households to provide that relief. That being said, there's a very, very clear message that came out of the government's Economic Inclusion Advisory Forum just a couple of weeks ago, where they made it very, very clear that those rates of support benefits are far too low and they really need to be increased. They're actually acting as a barrier for people to participate in society and do things like find a job.
The other thing that isn't actually coming into effect this year, but it's still was talked about last year, stage 3 tax cuts. And the government, they've talked about it. I think they've been kind of adamant that they're not going to move, although they have at the same time, I will say there have been reports that they will move on it eventually. I don't think we're expecting it this budget. But this again, kind of like the issue of raising Jobseeker, it seems to be an issue that will not go away for them until a kind of definitive stance is taken, or something like that.
Nor should it, Leo. It's bad policy. It was bad policy when the coalition government introduced it. It was bad policy when Labor supported it when in opposition. It remains bad policy given the state of the economy. It is deeply problematic in terms of driving inequality. It degrades the progressive nature of our taxation system at a really structural level. It's expensive at $20 billion a year, thereabouts, to begin with. That's money that we could be spending elsewhere, and it's being heavily targeted at high income earners. Most of the benefits go to people earning over $120,000 a year. And the higher up those income brackets you go, the greater the percentage of savings that they get. All the way up to people earning $200,000 a year will receive a $9,000 a year tax break. Of that money, 2/3 of it goes to men. Only one third of it will go to women, because that's the nature of those higher income tax brackets. So the idea that it should go through at all is kind of nonsense. The government has avoided dealing with the issue. They've said it's something that was agreed by the previous government. They're not going to deal with it now. It doesn't come into effect until July 1st, 2024, so it doesn't need to be touched. I don't agree with that. I think the public needs the certainty that says that money is not going to be given to those wealthy and high income earners, that we are going to use it elsewhere. And they certainly need to stop using it as an excuse for us not to be able to afford things like raising the Jobseeker rate. Let's say I am the Treasurer, Leo, and I do get to implement some of our policy. I think two of the key areas that we would be looking to address is climate change. And really shifting the way in which we fund our climate action, and stop funding fossil fuels. So we still have in the budget, and there was research out just today or just recently by the Australia Institute indicating that we still subsidise the fossil fuel industry in Australia to the tune of about $14 billion a year. Now, at a time when we're trying to transition away from fossil fuels, the idea that you would subsidise an industry that you're trying to transition away with doesn't make a great deal of sense. We have $2 billion that we're expecting to see allocated to infrastructure in the Northern Territory to allow for gas extraction out of the Beetaloo Basin, now that that's been approved. Again, like, that's money that you just wouldn't spend on an industry that you are trying to transition away from. Instead, we would be putting that kind of investment into electric vehicles, into renewable energy, and into the type of infrastructure needed to distribute renewable energy more reliably around the country. That'd be one area. And by investing seriously, I mean tens of billions of dollars. So you think about the sort of money we're spending on subsidies at the moment, start to spend that volume of money rather than the hundreds of millions that we see on electric vehicle policy instead. So you start to spend that money there. The second big thing is a whole raft of issues broadly related to inequality in Australia, both wealth and income inequality. We see it in the gender pay gap. We see it in retirement outcomes for women. So we would be looking to actually make changes in the opposite direction for the taxation system, both at a corporate tax level and at the level of individual taxes, to rebalance that income take so that we move the burden away from low income earners. We'd actually increase the tax-free threshold. We'd increase the rates of corporate and personal tax. And And we absolutely advocate for the increase in the Jobseeker and other benefits up above the Henderson Poverty Line, and then have them indexed at that level so that they don't become this constant political tug of war about the deserve versus the undeserving poor.